Hey everyone, welcome to our video instruction on how to respond to a document-based question, or DBQ. So let's do an overview. Like the FRQ you've already done, a DBQ is one of the tools that we use to measure your proficiency on one of the objectives in APUSH. It's also a written question, just like the FRQ. So if there are, for example, 7 objectives for period 1, one of those objectives will be a DBQ question that you will respond to. The prompt is a short primary source document. That means it comes from the time period that we are studying. It might be text. In the early days, it might be a hand-drawn image or political cartoon. Later on, it could be a photograph, a visual sort of document. Both text and visual are primary source documents. Your response is 1 paragraph in length. It runs about a quarter of a page, similar to the FRQ. If you get too much longer than that, that means you've just got a lot of extraneous information you don't need, and you're probably going to get tight on time in your answer. Like all objectives, the DBQ is 10 points. We score it using a rubric, which you'll see in the next video. And this is a document analysis. It's not a thesis-driven argument like the FRQ. So we're not going to be using a thesis, support it with evidence, and then connect with an argument. This is more of a descriptive response than an explanatory one. So take a second and let's look at our sample DBQ document. This is a letter from King Mbemba of Congo to King John III of Portugal. You see a couple things here. It's not real long, which is great. There are some words in there you may not know, are some phrases that you may stumble over, like vassals. You may not know what vassals are. But generally, if you read through, skipping over those words, you'll get the context and the main idea of what the document is about. I strongly encourage you to read all the way down here through the end, because there's important information at the second paragraph as well as the first. One thing that trips students up is sometimes they skim the first paragraph of the DBQ and they go, oh, I got it, and they miss the vital point of the document in the second paragraph. Often, but not always, the first paragraph is setting up the second paragraph. Now let's take a look at these little dots here. These are called points of ellipse. And this is where the editors have gone through and they've trimmed down this letter. They've cut stuff out here, 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 and here. You see they added the word to here so that that phrase makes sense. That shows us that they have taken everything out of the document that they don't think you need to know. So everything that's left is relevant and important. There's nothing that's skippable as far as the parts of the document go. So take a minute, pause the video, read through this a couple times, and get a feel for what King Mbemba is trying to explain or tell to King John of Portugal. Again, if you don't know some of the words, use your context clues, but don't worry if parts of it are a little fuzzy at this point. When you're ready, unpause, and we'll move on to looking at structure. Okay, you're back. Let's take a look at the structure of the DBQ. So I'm going to make a lot of comparisons here to the FRQ, the free response question, which we used T to structure. We had our thesis, we brought in evidence, and then we concluded it with an argument. T goes out the window like they did in Boston. History joke. And we're bringing in my absolute favorite animals at the St. Louis Zoo, the hippos. Everybody loves the hippo, and everybody tells you hippos kill more people than lions every time they mention them. So let's talk a little bit about hippo in history. The first thing, H, is historical context. And this is where you will describe the period of history the document is from, and then do your best to link it to a specific historical event. These documents are picked because they're related to something in a broader period of history. Can you figure that out? Next is the intended audience. Who is the creator? That's the term we use for artist or author. Who is the creator trying to reach, and why did they pick that person or persons? Point of view. discusses what biases and background does the creator bring to the document. The person who sat down and wrote it is human. They have opinions, and they're writing something or creating something that they feel strong enough about to put pen or crayon to paper. So what is their background? What influences what's going into this document? There's an old phrase that says there's two sides to every story, and then there's the truth. And that's because when people tell stories, let's talk about a story for a breakup. There's his side and her side, or his side, depending on what the relationship is, but they're probably not going to agree on why the couple broke up. And then somewhere between those two stories is the truth. So in point of view, we're trying to figure out what's the side that this person is on this historical event, and what does their background contribute to the ideas they have. Purpose describes what the author or creator is intending to do. If you're going to sit down and write a letter, what are you expecting to happen as a result of that letter? If you draw a political cartoon, how are you hoping it's going to influence people? And then finally, outside evidence. You need to include something in your analysis that comes from your knowledge that you learned in class that isn't directly taken from the document. And that outside evidence, if it's done well, and this takes some practice, should link the document, the main idea of the document, to that historical context that you described, specifically the historical event that you know the document is related to. And that kind of brings it full circle, and the O takes it back up to the H that we started with. Okay, we need to talk about the phrases identify and describe, because these are two of the big phrases in history that we use a lot. On the FRQ, we talked about description and explanation requires a because statement. Here it's identify and describe. So if you identify something, you correctly make a mention of it. For example, Bartolomé de las Casas was a Spanish Roman Catholic priest in the New World. That's factually correct. You mentioned something very brief, not a lot of information. If you describe something, you have more D's, development and detail. So look at this. Same first sentence, Bartolomé de las Casas was a Spanish Roman Catholic priest in the New World. Despite being a European and a priest, Las Casas was strongly opposed to Spanish abuse and murder of the Native American people under the justification of spreading Roman Catholic faith. Wow, that tells us a lot more about Bartolomé de las Casas, tells us about his background, and gives us some clues about what his bias is. So when you go to write the DBQ, the structural notes that I have are much less. There's no all caps words that you have to hit. You do need to put hippo into your essay, label it with HIPPO at the end of each sentence where you're doing hippo. Now, we have a P problem in APUSH, and we have too many P's in hippo. So what we're going to do is we're going to abbreviate point of view as POV and purpose just as regular P. So you're going to have HIPOVPO in your essay. Got it? Okay, so let's take a look at the prompt. It's the same document that we saw earlier, and you're going to be asked to respond with the document analysis using hippo. If you need a second, pause and skim it again. If you think you're fairly on top of it, let's look at the response. Okay, so in our response, the first thing we do is historical context. And I always start this way. I just tell straight out, what is this document? It's a letter from King Mbemba of Congo, written while European nations were colonizing Africa. Bam, I've identified the period. Pretty broad, colonization of Africa by Europeans. Then I go and hit the home run. Specifically when the trade of enslaved people in Africa by white Europeans was taking place. I've gone from broad colonization to specific trading of enslaved people by white Europeans. That's a identify and a describe. It's got both parts. The next one is my intended audience. King Mbemba wrote to King John. Oops, I have the second. Should be the third. Don't want to confuse him with his father. King Mbemba wrote to King John III since he was the only person who could control the Portuguese colonizers in Africa. Identify. I'm identifying the audience, King John. That's pretty short and simple. But then I go on to describe why he's the audience. Why did King Mbemba choose to write this letter to King John? That's always a way to get more points in a DBQ response, is to actually explain, here's the audience, this is why they were chosen. It also makes sure that you don't go for overly broad audiences like voters or the American people. You want to keep it specific and as narrow as possible. Some documents like this one specifically tell you the audience. Other documents you have to figure out for yourself. And it may not always be a specific person. It could be a group of particular people. All right, we move on to point of view. As an African king, ding ding, I'm identifying his background. Mbemba strongly resented the influence of Europeans into his kingdom and the disruptions to his economy, culture, and society that Portuguese colonizers brought with them. Now I'm identifying some bias, that he's angry against the European. I go on to develop that with a discussion of his courteous tone to King John in the letter, where he's polite, he's not threatening, he's requesting, he's not getting fired up about it, shows us that he is being deferential, or he might be a little a little afraid or a little cautious of King John because he is so powerful. This definitely shows a degree of submissiveness to it. So that explains his bias. Tone is great to use when you're looking at a picture or a letter. What's the feeling you get from this? I'll talk about words in a second. King Mbemba's purpose then was to get King John to step in and stop the Portuguese from disrupting the culture and economy of Congo. Identify. And to specifically, notice I use that word here and here, to specifically interfere and stop the European enslavement of Congolese people. This specifically is saying, hey, I'm going from identify down to describe. I'm narrowing what his request is. Did you see that in the letter? It was hidden in the second paragraph. Well, I shouldn't say hidden. It was clearly stated in the second paragraph. Finally, it concludes with your outside evidence. It talks about the African slave trade, makes a mention of that, and then goes on to develop on why the African slave trade was needed, because there was a demand for labor by the Portuguese and Spanish in the New World. That connects up to the slave trade here. Not easy to do sometimes. That's where the best written DBQs come from, are from students that are able to make those connections using that outside evidence. But you'll notice it goes again beyond just a mention of the slave trade and stopping there. Now, one thing here I want to talk about when I was in point of view, you'll notice that there are no quotes from the document in the response. Please don't do that. Don't recopy a whole sentence of text. You've seen the document. I've seen the document. You don't need to quote the document, because what happens is students tend to just quote it and put it in their response as if it's self-explanatory. Here's a bunch of stuff this person said. Doesn't it make sense now that that's their point of view? That's not what you want to do. You want to describe their point of view based on what you read. Now, can you pull a word or a phrase into your response? Yes. If you want to talk about tone, for example, and there's a particular word or phrase that conveys that submissive tone, for example, he refers to King John as sir. If I had more room on my slide, I would have included that. To illustrate a point, that's okay. But I'm not quoting his entire sentence with the word sir in it. I'm just using that word to illustrate a more submissive tone. That takes a little skill and practice, and I don't recommend you start pulling words from the document into your textual response, your written response, until you feel more comfortable doing DBQ answers. It's best to put everything in your own words while you're at the beginning stage. With that, that's the end of our discussion on how to do DBQs. Make sure you pick up the second video where we quickly go through the rubric and explain how this response would be scored. If you have questions, email or ask your teacher. And as always, have a great day.